Yeah, we're going to start out with the West. Again, like I said before, we're going to start with the civil, like after Reconstruction, after the Civil War. This is chapter 17 in the Open Stax chapter. So, although we are starting after the Civil War, this chapter starts with what we usually call context in AP US history. And context just means what led up to the event. So, Manifest Destiny starts in the 1830s and 1840s. And it is something that was like promoted in popular culture, and the kind of fundamental part of it is that usually Anglo-white American settlers have a divine right and a responsibility to settle in the West, and that it was a good thing. It was their destiny to spread Protestant values, Protestant meaning Christian, and democracy. Newspapers like Horace Greeley were promoting this, and it basically said, like, go West, young man. That was also popularized in art, like this one, where the West was, shown as this golden opportunity, adventure, freedom, that this is what was necessary for the United States. And these popular images, helped promote Western expansion, but had little resemblance to what it was really like. We're going to focus first on the white settlers or Northern Europeans. There was a lot more like pull factors for them to go to the West. There was a little push factor in the fact that like there was a large increasing population in the East. Manifest Destiny is one of these pull factors. People believing in this popular belief that it was their destiny. People are also going out for economic reasons. They want gold. In 1849, they discovered gold in California. They're looking for farmland. They're going to start businesses. So one of the other pull factors into the West is economic opportunity. It is also part of this Manifest Destiny cultural. They want to go to spread their religion. The book doesn't really go over it, but one of the groups that are moving west are going to be the Mormons to set up their kind of utopian vision. Protestants are going to spread their belief, and there is just this kind of like natural idea that this land is empty and it is for, white settlement. There is a sense of nationalism in this as well, because most of this land that we're settling is not controlled by the United States. Parts of it were controlled by Mexico before people moved there, or England if you're going to Oregon. And so there's a sense that like, occupation means that we are adding it to the United States. And so people are moving for all of these reasons, especially white settlers. But when they get out there, it is a harsh journey. It would take months. People would be on these wagon trails, going to Oregon or California on these trails. Even though they would go in great numbers, many of people died. There's illness and starvation and other dangers. So the journey was hard. It would take months. And then when they got there, there was a real lack of resources. The Great Plains is grasslands with hard soil, or what we call sod. And these homesteaders, who are small farmers, would have to try to eke out a living with very few resources. So they would have to like basically build their houses out of dirt, because that was the only resource available. There is drought, there is insects. They'd have to go into debt to try to make this work. And why are they going to build their houses out of dirt? Well, there is no lumber. There is like very few trees out on the Great Plains. There are no stones. And so literally the only resource they had was the sod itself. And so they would build their houses out of sod. So it's very harsh conditions in the West. For Mexican Americans, this is, there's a saying that, the border crossed us. So when folks are moving into the West, they are going to be, moving from what was the United States into areas that were controlled by Mexico. And they would be going up into here, like California or Oregon, which was controlled by England. And so we're going to fight a Mexican-American war. We'll go into that in our next semester. But when the United States took over this part of what was Mexico, there are people who were Mexican there before. And so there's a concept called the border crossed them. People who never moved, who never migrated, they actually went from being Spanish to Mexican to American within a short amount of time. Some of the folks who are out there are called rancheros. They have ranchos. These are large plots of land. They are landed gentry. And when the war was done, they were stated that they were going to be able to keep their religion. Much of their religion was Catholic, their culture and their property, and that they were supposed to be able to retain the rights of their language. They were going to be American citizens, and they were supposed to have their rights protected in full. Now, is this what happened? No. Within one generation, most of these people are going to be kind of like pushed out. Hispanic Americans are going to have their culture under attack, their legal protections take away. And so these people who had large plots of land, they are going to be, there's people who are called squatters, white folks who would basically get on their land, claim it as their own. And when they would go to courts, there would be Anglo courts, and they would like, take their land away. And as more and more Anglos moved out, they are going to, just basically force out people who lived there before. Of course, the people who were there, this vision of this empty land is not true. There were 250,000 Native Americans, a variety of tribes living on the Great Plains. Their culture was that they would like migrate over large areas of land, hunt buffalo. They had tribal ownership of land. There's no idea of like private ownership of land. And so these tribes would basically, have control over their hunting grounds, and this is how they lived. The bison or buffalo was their main way of life. This is one of the few groups that is going to have, what we call like teepees today, and then I guess as well. And they would use these because they would migrate with the herds. The Lakota is the one that we're going to focus on, is one of the tribes in the West. Indigenous folks, Plains Indians versus Americans is one of the conflicts. So as folks are moving out before the Civil War in the 1840s, there starts to be conflict as people are trying to go through these trails. And so the first Fort Laramie Treaty said that they would allow free passage for white settlers. They had a reservation with large amounts of hunting rights, this big plot of land, and they were supposed to get paid $50,000, I think, a year, and this never really happened. The government was supposed to protect the Lakota from white attacks, and this was a lot. And they were allowing white settlers to pass through. More and more people are moving in. This is going to escalate in 1862 with the Dakota War. The Dakotas are going to, because this treaty was never really, followed, they're going to start to retaliate. They're going to kill 1,000 white folks who are like passing through. Lincoln is the president in 1862 during the Civil War. He is going to, have one of the biggest mass executions in U.S. history as they go over and take care of the Dakotas. And there are various ideas of, the U.S. citizens violating treaties. One is the Sand Creek Massacre. So it's almost like politicians in the East would make these treaties, and then people in the West would just violate them. And the Sand Creek Massacre, Black Kettle was flying a white flag, an American flag. He was cooperating with the U.S. Government. And then white militias just went in and basically killed the entire settlement. So one of the conflicts that are happening in the East are between those who are there, the indigenous folks, and Anglo settlers who are moving west. And during the Civil War, the government is really focusing on promoting Western settlement. One of the things, and the word I would remember, is this idea of incentives. They are not building the railroads. They are giving incentives to private corporations to build the railroads. We are fighting the Civil War, and there is not a lot of money in the 1860s. And so what they have is a lot of land that they just got from Mexico. So they said to these corporations, if you build a mile of track, you would get 10 miles of land on each side. And they basically negated any native rights to land. They gave them the right of way. They're also going to give them bonds for every mile they lay. The other thing they're doing is they're trying to encourage individual settlers to go west with a Homestead Act. They basically said to folks that if you went west onto these government lands, you would get 160 acres of free land if you improved it or basically farmed it. The other thing they're going to do is secure the area with forts. And this is how they are trying to promote Western settlement. One of the major groups of folks who are going to be the labor on the Transcontinental Railroad are Chinese immigrants. It was actually easier for uh, people to come from China on across the sea to get to California than it was for people to migrate before the railroad to the west. So the United States government actually had treaties. They had special status with China. They are encouraging Chinese folks to come to the West Coast. Some people start with the gold rush, and then many folks are going to become workers on the railroad. Almost immediately, they're going to be paid less than whites. They're going to have the most dangerous jobs, blasting out mines in the Rocky Mountains. Many people are going to die on this labor. Significantly, Chinese people could not become citizens, so they could never gain political power. They are going to face extra taxes and discrimination almost immediately. The Transcontinental Railroad is going to be completed in 1869. This is probably one of the most significant events that we need to remember. This is the Golden Spike is going to connect these two corporations together in Promontory, Utah. And now something that used to take months of a harsh journey is only going to take a matter of days. This is going to increase migration west. It's also going to be able to bring resources east and west. So lumber could be brought from the east to help build the western towns. We can extract all these resources like gold and silver. It's going to interconnect the economy of the United States, and it's probably one of the most significant events, and it will come up a lot. So one of the things here is, like demographic changes. Before the railroad is completed, it was mainly moderately prosperous whites who are moving west who could afford it. After, we're going to have less affluent new immigrants, Irish immigrants, Scandinavians, people who are going to be able to afford a railroad trip to go west who couldn't afford it before. So we're going to have many more folks moving west who are of less affluent means. And so this means for things like farmers, they're no longer going to have to build their house out of, dirt. They're going to have lumber for new construction. They're going to have new machinery. There was an invention of a chilled plow that allowed them to cut through the sod a little bit easier. There's going to be mechanical mowers and like manure spreaders and all of these things. But even though there is these things, the farmers are still not going to have a lot of money. So they are going to be going into debt to afford all of this. They also have to pay the price of shipping. The railroads were charging high rates for shipping. And so while there is more things available, they're going to go more into debt on these farmers. The people who are really able to make money in the West are called bonanza farms. These are just large farms with equipment that could hire migrant workers and were making the money. Women had a really tough time in the West. This is mostly a male-dominated migration. They're going to face the same hardships as men, and they're going to have to face the risks of childbirth. What starts to happen in the West is that, because women are such an equal partner in these hardships, they are, cleaning and sewing, and they have to do all of the farm work. It is actually the West that is going to be the first ones to give women the right to vote. So states gave women the right to vote before it was a national amendment, which is going to happen in 1920. So, for example, Wyoming in 1869 is going to grant women the right to vote because of, this. And the gold rush is one of these classic ideas of like miners going out west with their little pans and like easily portable tools. And that is what happened in 1849. But when the railroad is going to come in, what is it going to allow to happen is like large mining corporations and these large mining operations are going to move in. They are going to be bringing in hydraulic, pumps and high pressure water jets and all of these things. And so it quickly becomes mining is no longer, prospectors. It is these large corporations who are able to extract the metals out of the ground. Mining towns will develop around these corporations, and people will go to become labor. Cattle ranching is another element of the West. Before, the Anglos moved in, there were rancheros who had these large tracts of land who were herding longhorns. And as the railroads move west, what's going to happen is that people are going to start to these cattle, the longhorns, are going to become more profitable. And so people are going to, settle in there, start these large ranches, and herd these longhorns. So, men typically in their 20s, these ranchers would own the cattle, and then cowboys would be the one who would take the cattle from Texas to what we call the railheads. These are going to be what cowboys do. They basically go on these long cattle drives to take the cattle to these towns to put them on the train, and then they will go into the east into these meat packing plants. We'll kind of go over this more in class. There's kind of a myth of violence, but there is a lot of truth to it. So if you have these towns that are mainly young men, cattle, these like cattle railheads or mining towns, there was only about like, I think in one town there was only 30 women for 2,500 men. Many of them are owning brothels. They are business women. This is another element of women who had more power because there was very few of them. You have young men who are just getting paid with lots of money, and there is a lot of vice and violence in these towns. There is also range wars. So as these animals are wandering the open range, people are going to fight over grazing rights or watering holes. People would cut fences and do these other things. And so there would be battles over, where the cattle could go. There is a little bit of fiction to this too. Many of these people are going to be homesteaders, their families, and the fact that middle-class business owners are going to move in after the railroad. They're going to try to civilize the West. Corporations own much of the West, so it's not like, it is quite as wild as you imagine. Also, a lot of people like teachers and social, folks are going to be moving out there as well. One of the other major inventions that you need to remember is going to be barbed wire. This is going to enclose the open range. So whereas the West was wild and open, barbed wire was an easy, cheap way to fence in the land. Native Americans are going to call it the devil's wire because it's basically going to stop all of the migration of the bison. There is no more open range for the cattle drives. And as we are fencing in these areas, as people have this privately owned land, bison are going to be replaced by cattle. This is going to lead to a environmental disaster of overgrazing and help contribute to the near extinction of the buffalo. Another group who's migrating west is going to be African Americans. These people are called Exodusters. These are folks mainly from the South who were freed after the Civil War. They are looking for opportunity, and many of them are going to migrate to Kansas. By 1890, over 500,000 Black folks lived west of the Mississippi River. Many are going to become farmers. 12,000 are going to work as cowboys in the Texas cattle drive. Some of them are going to actually become buffalo soldiers. Many of these folks are going to be from the Union armies from the North who are already freed African Americans, and they're going to be used as fighters in the Native American wars. They're also going to become part of the, helping secure national lands afterwards. These are all Black cavalry and infantry units. Native Americans are going to resist this encroachment on their land. One success they have is the Battle of Little Bighorn. As the Lakota they were trying to kick the Lakota off of the Black Hills, which was secured under that treaty we talked about earlier. Sitting Bull is going to organize not just the Lakota, but other surrounding tribes. Custer is an American general who was tasked with securing the Black Hills. He looked at an encampment of people. He looked at the teepees. He was like, I think this is just going to be women and children. But what it was 3,000 Lakota, Cheyennes, and Arapaho warriors. And when Custer tries to go in and kill everybody, they surround him and kill 262 men. It's the single greatest loss of American forces in the Western expansion. Although they win this battle, relatively quickly they're going to lose the war. And the United States is going to be able to focus on the West after the Civil War. They're going to push in with great numbers of forces, and they're going to force Native American tribes to relocate into smaller and smaller reservations. At the same time, there's going to be the near extermination of the bison, which will force folks onto the reservation as they cannot keep their native way of life. I won't read the whole quote, but Chief Joseph in 1877 said, "I'm tired and my heart is sick and sad, and from where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." As folks are pushed onto the reservations, these reservations have, are not really readily able to be farmed. The bison are getting extinct, and people are going to turn to a ceremony called the ghost dance to connect with their ancestors. This is started by the Paiute Lakota, a spiritual leader, but it's a pan-Indian movement, meaning that it goes through not just the Paiute, but into the Lakota and other groups as well. They believed that if they performed this ceremony, the buffalo would return, their ancestors would return, and they would be able to expel all of the settlers. It is kind of like, a thing that they're trying to do to reclaim their identity. And white settlers see this and they start to fear that there's going to be another uprising. They call in the cavalry, and this is going to lead to Wounded Knee. So, as one example is, in the Lakota reservation, people were actually, gathering together to perform the ghost dance because Sitting Bull had been killed at the hands of tribal police. And I'll just go to this. But if as they were doing the ghost dance right here in the middle, the army is going to surround the camp with artillery. They're on the hills. They are staring down this group of people. A gun is going to go off, and essentially the U.S. troops who are surrounding this encampment just open fire. And indiscriminately, 150 to 300 men, women, and children are going to be killed, many of them in the back. The U.S. troops are going to suffer 25 fatalities, but much of this was the crossfire because they were, surrounding the encampment and firing across the land. And 25 of these soldiers are going to be given the Congressional Medal of Honor. The captain said, "I know these men did not aim deliberately, and they were greatly excited. I did not believe they saw their sights. They fired rapidly, but it seemed to me only a few seconds till there was not a living thing before us. Warriors, squaws, children, ponies, and dogs went down before us in that unaimed fire." Wounded Knee is considered the last Indian battle. It is a massacre. But essentially after this, the United States is going to start to change their policies towards what they were calling the Indian problem. Previously, the policy was basically the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And by the 1880s and 1890s, progressive reformers are going to say, maybe we shouldn't kill everybody. Maybe we should kill the Indian and save the man. And by this, what they mean is Americanize, or what we call assimilate, Native Americans. So what they're going to do is encourage individual land ownership, Christian worship, and education for children. Folks involved in this are like clergy or ministers, social workers, government officials. One of the major U.S. acts that you have to remember is called the Dawes Act. They're going to get rid of this idea of large tribal ownership of land, and they are going to allot or give 160 acres to each individual family. There is no more of this idea of tribal land. It is going to decrease the size of the reservation. And then the surplus land, I'll put that in quotes, is given to white settlers. The land they are given is not good land to farm. There is a reason why they had never settled and farmed before this. And starvation, desperation is going to soon, come about. They're going to become more dependent on government handouts. And Indian schools are going to be created to promote assimilation. So the impact here is that we went from having these large Dakota lands to these smaller allotments. And then all of this land that they are increasingly taking away is going to be given to white folks. Another reason why they wanted to get the Black Hills is because they discovered gold on that land. One of the elements that you need to remember is called the Carlisle Indian School. Native Americans are going to be removed from their families on the Great Plains in Kansas and all of these other places. They're going to be taken to Pennsylvania and forced to cut their hair, forced to speak English. There are harsh conditions and punishments. There is abuse. And these children are going to be assimilated into the American way of life. Another group that is going to face discrimination is going to be Chinese immigrants. So while we wanted the Chinese immigrants to come in to work on the railroad, when the railroad is completed, whites, and especially like we said, of like lower means, are going to be able to move west looking for work. And as these people are filling in California, when they're looking at Chinese population, they have racism, they have fear of economic competition, and they almost immediately start organizing anti-coolie clubs, which is a racist term for Chinese, and they're going to boycott stores. And it is going to be a successful movement because in 1882, we're going to have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which ends any immigration of Chinese folks into the United States. This is the first immigration restriction in United States history. Only 5% of the people who had immigrated here from China were women. And this is going to force the people who are here, they could not leave because if they left, they couldn't really come back for this opportunity. They're going to have to take low paying jobs and they kind of protect themselves because there was, no one who was really protecting them. They're going to, remain in enclaves or Chinatowns to try to create a community. Hispanic Americans, as we kind of talked about before, are just going to be outvoted, outnumbered, and outcast. Similar to Chinese Americans, there's going to be racist laws that target them. One of them are actually called greaser laws, which are going to basically allow the imprisonment of any unemployed Mexican American because of vagrancy. We're going to see that this is very similar to what was happening in the South with segregation. It's also going to outlaw a lot of cultural practices. They're going to make things illegal on Sundays that where their cultural practices. And but what happens is, even though they have citizenship rights, which the Chinese people did not have, they were outnumbered. So as Anglos move in, they're going to be outvoted. They don't have control in the courts. So if there was any disputes, it would go towards the Anglos. And similar to Mexican Americans, they're going to be given lower pay and be forced into these things. So as a review, before the Civil War, there's the gold rush in 1848. And there is going to be migration before the Civil War. During the Civil War, the United States government is going to give incentives for people to move west and build the railroad with the Homestead Act and the Railway Acts and encourage Western migration. The Native Americans, including in the Dakotas, are going to start resisting. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be completed, which is going to allow for this, more migration and, resources to be moved west. It's going to allow corporations to move in. Barbed wire is going to be invented in 1873, which is going to allow the enclosure of the West. The Battle of Little Bighorn is going to be one of the big wins for Native Americans. Are they escalating their resistance? Quickly after that, though, we're going to have Native American losses and Wounded Knee. The Chinese Exclusion Act is going to be passed in 1882, and the Dawes Severalty Act is one of these, acts of assimilation, which is going to take away tribal land and give them individual allotments. All right, that's the chapter.